can get rid of that section. Okay, hello everyone. We're back again with the beautiful Julia Holloway and Karen Mitchell, and Adoyo, who is trying to get on camera, and will in just a minute as soon as I'm able to make. Ah, look at that.
Yes.
Ta-da! Okay, so this will have to do, and my friends, thank you so much for joining me again. Can you see me? I feel like I'm in the shadow. Okay, great. So this week we're talking about book 5, which after last week's intense conversation about trauma and Julia's beautiful observations about the symbolism of Maya, the cat, and the mirror, I read book 5 one more time with all of those in mind. And I remember, Karen, you remember in our first meeting when Julia brought up the ubiquity of water imagery throughout the book, right? Yes. And Julia pointed out water, the book starts out on water, and book 1 is dominated by Nam Lolwe. And then as we go into deeper books, the water keeps recurring and it becomes very, very prominent. At the end of book 4, when Alex comes to look after Maya, and then book 5 is all water. In fact, the book begins water, water everywhere. Now, you may recognize in some of the intertextual echoes, and I think I'd mentioned it before when we were talking about Alex's archival education, that the echoes of what Alex knows, the things that he learns from books, the poetry that he reads in books, shows up or is filtered through Maya's perception. And water, water everywhere is a ritornello from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the mariner is describing this sort of ill-fated trip where he's not sure whether he is having slain the albatross that was supposed to be a mark of good fortune, is what's responsible for their ship being dead in the water, for the soldiers starving, for death coming upon them, right, and taking them and picking them off one by one. This mariner survives that ill-fated trip, returns, and makes it, his life becomes about stopping visitors everywhere or travelers everywhere to tell them about his story, right? And one of the most beautiful editions of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the one that's illustrated by Gustave Doré. Doré was an incredibly talented engraver, and he engraved the Bible, the Quixote, the Commedia, obviously, and also the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And so you see this bony, sort of haggard mariner who stops a wedding guest to tell him the urgency of this story that he has to tell about that ill-fated trip. The wedding guest at first is circumspect. He's not sure what this man wants, but pretty soon he gets completely drawn into the story, and he can't help but listen to this horrific tale, right, that the mariner has to tell. What's really interesting to me, we spoke last week a little bit about channeling, right, about listening to the story and transcribing it as it develops. But what's really interesting to me about this recurring ritornello of Coleridge is that it seems to show up anytime there's a sense of hopelessness, right? When Maya is sort of mired in she doesn't quite know a way out of the situation she's in some kind of distress, but it's a sort of a distress in denial, if that makes any sense, right? So it's not a distress that she's facing, but rather distress where she has found some other way not to face the reality of where she is. And this is essentially book 5, right? So book 5 finds us, I think, in a situation which I will confess this to you guys because y'all, I think I trust you well enough to tell you this without fear of recrimination, is that when I was writing that very first paragraph, I could see the room very clearly, but I had difficulty with the words, right? I used the dictionary heavily for this one paragraph. I mean, heavily. I always have several dictionaries open when I'm writing anyway. It doesn't matter what I'm writing. It can be an essay, a journal article, and sometimes even an email. And the reason why I have dictionaries open is part of it, and I think you may be able to relate to this, Julia, is sometimes when you're thinking or working in multiple languages, especially related languages, false friends present themselves in the place of the real word. And sometimes the spellings are very close, but just altered a little bit, going from one language to another. And so I always have to check, right? Usually just the spelling of something. I say, well, is this how we spell it in English, right? And sometimes when a false friend presents itself and I write the sentence and then later on I look at it, I go, wait, that's not saying what I thought it's supposed to be saying, right? So I have to double check my dictionary and my thesaurus to make sure that it's saying what I thought it was meant to be saying. And that happened a lot with this paragraph. Now, when I read the paragraph, it'll seem like there aren't any complicated words in it, right? But let me read it, and then we can start from there. But let me read it so that I might just give you a sense of how, as a writer, I found myself at once immersed in Maya's dream vision, but also the writer, the scribe part of me, completely at sea in terms of how to render that dream vision into text, right? So I'll read this. Canto 29. Water, water, everywhere. Soft sunlight spills through the broad glass block windows that adorn the westward wall of the bathroom, carrying with it watery silhouettes of the blooming jacaranda and eucalyptus trees cast against the clear sky. A few keen rays shoot through the open awning glass above the windows near the ceiling, the rest of the light gently muted, as if mindful not to touch Maya's raw flesh. She floats facing up in the tub, heaving a gulping breath before dipping her head below the surface of the water, her ravaged right arm anchored to the edge of the tub as her tiny body bobs about. She purses her lips, as if to whistle, and blows out a string of bubbles, moving her head to and fro in the water, humming faintly. It seems like a simple paragraph. I don't know what you guys think of it. I still have a hard time actually reading through it.
I thought it was beautiful. And I remember the first thing I thought of is, this is so perfectly tuned. You must have been inspired by maybe watching your niece or nephew in the This, you had to have seen that.
Yes.
Because it's so clear.
This is fantastic to hear. Julia, what do you think?
Well, I loved it too, partly because my very first memory is of the water, the Thames rippling on my nursery ceiling. And here I've seen a house built with glass blocks like that in Princeton. And so I was sort of, putting this architecture together with that scene. But also, one identifies oneself with this tiny body in the water. It's a very moving scene, and the light and the water together.
And if I may contribute to the commentary, I really love the idea of jacaranda and eucalyptus trees from outside, having their silhouettes cast against the window. So you don't quite see them, but you just see the image of them. And then the sunlight sort of sort of spilling, for lack of, I think the right word is spilling, sort of spilling into the room through these very, very high windows, right at the top
Yes.
of it. I find it a very evocative paragraph, and when I was listening to it and trying to find the words for it, I do remember having to look at something technical. I wondered what glass block tiles were called. Like, that's the first thing I wrote, glass block tiles, because that's what they looked like to me when I was visualizing. But then I thought, is that what they're called? Like in the ordinary world, are they called glass block tiles? And lo and behold, they were called glass block tiles, right? And then when you do a Google search for images, the pictures that came back to me were exactly what I visualized. So I thought, oh, this is very, very cool. So let me very quickly just do again a summary of the book, and then I will open the floor to wonderful guests, especially Karen, since I know you have to run off. So book 5 is called Rain, and it concerns how Maya's waking dream, in the wake of Rosie's flight, transports her aboard the São Raphael, a carrack on Vasco da Gama's first voyage around the African coast. While she walks the deck of the ship together with Frei João de Sousa, the mist and rain in Maya's waking dream mingle with Akoth's memory of the rains that fall over the savanna grassland and the equatorial mountain of God's repose, the Great Nam Lolwe, and the ancient River Nile. Maya dreams the legend of the snake people in her sleep. So Canto 29 opens up with Maya floating on the tub, and Alex hearing Mama Akoth finally arrive, right? And the Mama Akoth's return home after her long walk during the day is signaled by this very quick exchange in that second paragraph of just them hearing, right, and registering that she realizes something is wrong from the way the maid and the houseboy respond to her. Maya, in the meantime, is a 5-year-old child playing in the tub, right? She's blowing bubbles. She's shrieking about wanting to go again. She seems to, the forgetting that started at the end of book 4 seems to have now completely taken effect. And all she can remember is that she's having fun in the tub. And then suddenly this cross or star appears or melds of the water reflected on the ceiling, turns into a cross and a star. And essentially everything that was described about the compass in Canto 1, right, with the vines and the berries, seemed to materialize before her eyes. And the next thing we know, before Maya appears, we are on the ship in Canto 30. We are on the ship with Frei João de Sousa, and now the voice, the storyteller's voice, shifts without notice to that of a Portuguese crew member writing about their journey, like writing about their mission. This becomes, and mind you, I noticed this in retrospect, the Portuguese storytellers are the only ones who get first-person narrator perspective. I don't know if you guys noticed that. Every other story, like the story of Mama Akoth, Maya, everything that has to do with them, even Hera, the narrator's voice is in a third person, sort of omniscient. But the Portuguese narrator stories are first person, right? So you have a Portuguese scribe who is talking about their mission, talking in terms of we are on this mission, and I think he has a very sort of reiterative way of speaking, and I think if we have a tradition of church going, we know that one of the most important elements of liturgy, of worship, is the repetition of set phrases, right? You repeat the credo, you repeat sort of set passages that are supposed to be landmarks of the declaration of faith or adherence to the church and what have you. And the Portuguese storytellers' voices are very heavy with this reiterative almost liturgical repetition of their mission, the mission that's come down to them, not just from their king, but through their king, from the Pope, right? Because it is the Pope who declared or set the mandate for the Portuguese to go out and conquer the world, to go out and brutalize the rest of the world, right? To go out and be the masters of the universe that they ended up being in the way that they did. Intermingled with this reiterated voice of their papal and royal mission is elements of biblical texts, especially the Psalms, that in this case are shared with Mama Akoth, right? Because Mama Akoth has the same biblical biblical songs in her ear, and she passes this on to her descendants. And so going on to Canto 31, after, I guess Canto 30 ends with a switch from the Portuguese first person narrator to, again, the third person narrator of João de Sousa walking up and down the planks. And once we enter into the third person narrator, it is at that point that we discover that Maya is with him, because the Portuguese first person narrator cannot see or cannot conceive that there's someone walking with João de Sousa. So the third person narrator is the one who then has to be able to see that. And going into Canto 31, Maya is sitting there reciting things in Portuguese, and Alex is completely dumbfounded.
Obrigado.
Exactly. Obrigado. Obrigado, Frei João. Obrigado, Frei Alessandro. And then she has this ritornello herself, which is a obrigado, 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 right? As she's playing in the water toward the end of Canto 31. And at that point, because she's both in the bathtub and walking with Frei João on a boat which is stuck in the mist, right? A mist that slowly sort of aggregates to become rain, she feels the rain beginning to fall, and it hits her nose. And that enters into Canto 32. If you did any back of envelope calculations, you found that Canto 32 is the middle canto of the entire book, right? So there's 63 cantos in all. And this is the one that lands at the center of the book. And it is the one that does not recount any plot. There's, in essence, nothing happens in Canto 32, but rather the heart, the core idea behind rain as emblematic of the ephemeral and also universal nature of human life is articulated in this canto. And the only living things that make an appearance are actually non-human, the animals of the savanna, right? This ecosystem, this community of various types of animals who interact with each other in very organic and essentially harmonious ways, right? That don't seem to live with the same kinds of manufactured conflicts that we find among human societies, right? We know that the animal kingdom does have conflict and does have strife, and there's hunting and death and killing, but to riff on something that Mark Twain said about man being the only creature that can blush or needs to, the kind of violence that we encounter in the animal kingdom is not at all invested with the sort of malice that we find in human society. The violence of humanity is a violence born of malice, whereas the violence that we see in the natural world are violences born of necessity, right, and natural order. And so it strikes me as interesting that Canto 32, after presenting this idea about how everything is connected. And if you think of the raindrop as a single human being, a single human soul, right? And the metaphor being that the human life is, the length of it is from the moment the raindrop aggregates and falls to the moment it joins with the rest. Then it means that, I think it's a play on the notion that the soul does not dissipate into nothing. It just becomes part of something more, right? And it doesn't remain discrete and distinct once it joins the something more. I think it mixes, for lack of a better word, it mixes with the rest and, excuse me, re-manifests in combinations with others. I'm fascinated by this idea. I have been for a very, very long time. And from my perspective, as someone who pays attention to what Alex has been reading, it plays with the notion of reincarnation, right? So not reincarnation as a specific individual being recycled through the system of life and death, but rather the singular soul already constituted of many other experiences before it aggregates itself, then returning to reaggregate into the rest, or to reblend into the rest of everything, really, and then some element of it reaggregating again. We can talk about that later. So Canto 33. Once we leave Canto 32, whose end I really, really like, and if you'll indulge me, I'll just end. I'll read the final page of Canto 32, where this is on page 155, where I'll start where gazelles, right? Let me see. Okay, gazelles too and impalas often gather in small groups, hiding in the tall grasses, but the wildebeest prefer mighty congregations, especially in the seasons of migration. Other gathering herds of unnumbered medley, and the great cats that live among them all gather around shared waterholes and river lakelets. It is not unusual to find them all together at the waterholes along avian hosts, like the ibis and egrets, who keep pace and counsel with elephants, surely the grandest of these lords of the savannah. Deliberate and communal, the ways of these colossal beasts manifest an age-old love abiding for the waters brought to them by rivers, brought to them by rains. They roll in mud and splash and tread and dawdle away hot afternoons in the grassland pools, ponds, lakes, young and old alike, unmindful of the water snakes that slumber in the reeds and grasses all along the banks. The lion prides that sometimes come to share the watering holes are maybe even envious of these insouciant giants, or maybe just bewildered by their love for mud and water. All these creatures, great and small, drink in all creation's tales carried in the falling rain sent by heaven's eye, or gathered in the water of the rivers that traverse the lands and empty out to sea and to oceans that embrace the sky. And this is immediately followed by Akoth, who, in remembering her journey to, or at least we're told that Akoth knows about all of these, or everything that was just counted in Canto 32, especially toward the end, resides in Akoth's memory as well. And this manifests later, right, when Akoth is telling Maya the story of the snake people, because she shapes it in a way that reactivates this description of the savannah and the animals in it. We are also reminded again that Akoth knows the name of João de Sousa, despite the forgetfulness of the Iberians. João de Sousa is not an important enough figure for history books to recall, but he matters in the local histories, not only of Mombasa, but of the inland where Akoth grew up and was taught by missionaries. He matters in the local histories of India, right, where his story as a miracle worker sort of unfolded and was carried through oral tradition. So this is an instance where before, oral tradition has mostly been sort of framed as something that resides within the East African or the local African culture. But this João de Sousa becomes an example of how oral tradition really knows no bounds. Here's a European figure whose legacy, whose fame, whose renown, though absent from books, is still alive in the minds of the people who live in these places where he once walked. And then there's a return again to written history with the mention of the building of Fort Jesus. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Philip II, the King of Spain. He was it the grandson or the great-grandson? The great-grandson of Isabel and Ferdinand, right? So he inherited a huge kingdom. Remember, Isabel and Ferdinand, were patrons of Columbus, and Columbus goes and finds the Western Hemisphere and claims it for the Spanish Empire, right? And through political alliances and intermarriages, the court of Spain also creates alliances with the courts of Netherlands, yes, the courts of France, and the courts of Portugal, right? So that this king, Philippe II, is essentially has the blood of Dutch kings and Spanish kings and Portuguese kings all melded in him, because he's several generations hence. And so not only does he inherit the Spanish holdings in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, he also has reign over some of the Portuguese holdings, as well as the holdings of the Netherlands, right? Which include not only the upper part of Europe, but also whatever else they've acquired in the Far East, in Asia. And yet, this Philip II is one of the worst kings, right? One of the most irresponsible and wasteful of the kings. So much so that when Miguel de Cervantes wrote the Don Quixote, right, in 1607, he writes sort of a quote-unquote panegyric, right, in praise of Philip II, that is actually a scathing critique of this king and how he squandered the treasury of the Spanish Armada. And he's the one who lost to the British. He's the one who lost the Spanish Armada to the British. So he squandered the wealth of the Spanish in having sort of these useless baubles that were meant to aggrandize him, right? Instead of feeding his people, instead of administering to his kingdom, right? So all of this, you notice how it is presented with all of the pomp and circumstance of title, so that he's the one who's responsible for sending the Italian architect to Mombasa to build Port Jesus. And he is identified as the King of Portugal and all of the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, of Naples and Sicily and Sardinia, the great-grandson of Her Majesty Queen Isabella and His Majesty King Fernando, the venerable and prudent and most bureaucratic Felipe II. That's a quote from Cervantes, by the way. The venerable and prudent and most bureaucratic Philip II had called upon Giovanni Battista of Cairati, near Milan, for His Majesty was also the Duke of Milan, in the name of the crown and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to render service to that most exigent of mandates issued 110 fivefold years since by the Holy Father in Rome, to His Majesty Don Alfonso and the Lusitanian crown, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and thereby enable His Majesty the King to most justly and lawfully, by his authority, reduce their person to perpetual slavery, and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit, to the greater glory of God, with faith in the universal church. This is their mission, and this is the person who's sending them out to do it. So I'm almost done with my summary here. There's still a great deal of appeal to God and to liturgy and to religion. And finally, Canto 34 begins with, "When I was a child, I spake as a child," which is famous passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's a Bible passage. It's very, very popular, especially the section of it that talks about love, right? Love is kind, love is gentle, love is kind, love forgives all. It's a dense and beautiful and yet extremely accessible chapter from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And this is the part that Maya is fixated on. When I was a child, I spake as a child. There's a foreshadowing here that having heard Maya say this, Mama Akoth then managed to finally break out of her shell, right? In the naming of Hera, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. And it's at this point, hearing Maya recite this in Portuguese, she now gives Alex a mission. It's the first time we hear her actually telling Alex that he should teach Maya. He should teach her about Vasco da Gama. He should take her traveling. He should show her the world, right? And when she says, tell her about Vasco da Gama, Alex's first internal reaction, which he doesn't vocalize, but which all my Kenyan schoolmates, like everybody who grew up with me, everybody in Kenya really, will recognize, was this children's rhyme. I'm going to recite it here in full. Although, like many children rhymes, it's actually unknowingly quite raunchy, right? So it goes, Vasco da Gama went to the drama without his pajamas to show off his big banana, right? Now, I don't know why. I don't know why. Like, I never knew why that was how, because as a kid, you don't think about what that means, right? In retrospect, however, and you guys having read this book, in retrospect, I keep thinking, is this an allusion to Vasco da Gama's incredibly toxic masculinity, right? The idea that this man goes out into the world and all he cares about is subjugating through violence those that he encounters, right? Because the end of the rhyme, without his pajamas to show off his big banana, it's so innocuous sounding from a child's point of view, but from my adult point of view, I think to myself, things like, the ring around a Rosie, ashes, ashes, that's supposed to be an allusion to plagues and things like that. I wonder about that. I know that Kenyan scholars, Kenyan historians are aware of Vasco da Gama's terrorism, right? They're aware of just how what just happened? I'm sorry, guys. Did I just lose you? I think I just lost you. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear
you.
you.
Can. All right. I'm sorry. I lost you, but it's okay. I guess I'll just reset this and see if I can see you again. So there we go. So they're aware of Vasco da Gama's terrorism, and it strikes me as interesting from a social historical point of view that this is one of the I guess the nursery rhymes that we knew as children, right, about Vasco da Gama, without any gloss to teach us about the underlying toxic masculinity that it was alluding to. And then finally, Canto 34 segues into Maya asking for a bedtime story because it's time for her to sleep. And Mama Akoth begins the story. Once Alex is at a loss, he doesn't know what to do. Mama Akoth begins with Chon Chon Gilala, a long, long time ago, which is a way that Luo storytelling begins. And then she proceeds to tell Maya this story that recalls so much of what we heard in Canto 32. Canto 35 brings us, I believe, the story of Alex beginning to teach Maya, taking her into the library and beginning to teach her about Vasco da Gama and all the Portuguese sailors, and also brings us into a recollection of Hera's naming ceremony, that moment when Mama Akoth, made the decision to break with this tradition and let go of childish ways and claim this infant soul who seemed that she wasn't going to be claimed. And so this is all of Canto 5. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic on over to you, Julia, because I'm eager to hear your perspective.
Right. I'd like to go back to the end of book 4, where you have the story of the lost needle. And there's a line where you compare the needle to the compass needle, as if Maya has lost the compass, which might sort of explain this wonderful right brain time shifting that she does. And then I love the scene where she's muttering Portuguese. Where did you get this Portuguese from? And then you go into the ship scene and so forth. You also mention the Thomas Christians. And I was librarian in my convent, and the bishop gave us a wonderful thesis one of his students had written, who was a Thomas Christian. And the thesis was on Ma Thomas, and it's Ma Thomas. We'll say this for the others. This is Doubting Thomas, who journeys from the Holy Land to India and converts this region in India. And they have manuscripts. And then the Portuguese Jesuits arrive and they destroy the manuscripts. They don't accept the Ma Thomas Christianity, although it is so old and so authentic. And then these newer versions coming in can't accept the almost indigenous version of Christianity. And I found it fascinating that you have this ability between the Ma Thomas Christians and that they're understanding each other, the languages. And it's they who give Vasco da Gama the ability to do the navigation to India, which you describe. And then I loved the creation story, the serpents coming up in the water. There's a Welsh version of the two serpents in the
Really?
stories, which is very similar. Also, the Aborigine, the serpents are extremely sacred. Find about the cross, like remember in the Exodus, they had to hold up the cross with the serpent and so forth. And then when you have the naming of the child, and there are no spirits that come to name this child, because it is really out of wedlock. So it doesn't have the ancestors of the family. And I love the way Akoth gives it a name. I'm absolutely fascinated and intrigued by this form of narration
Mm-hmm.
to do of the two worlds, the oral and the scribal,
Mm-hmm.
through the mind of Maya.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Um,
I wish we still had Karen with us.
no, Karen had to actually go to work. She had to,
Yes, yes,
she,
yes.
she said that she would stop by if she could, and so I'm really glad that she did stop by. And I'm reflecting on what you've just said, and I I'm fascinated by the last thing that you just said right now about that you're fascinated by the forms of narration between the scribal and the oral. And can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And then after that, I want to ask you about the Welsh version of the serpent story, because I think that would be really interesting to know.
Yes. It's a bit vague in my memory, but there's
Mm-hmm.
two serpents that are fighting each other.
Ah,
It's a Merlin story.
yes, yes, uh-huh.
It's in the Arthurian prophecies, which
Mm-hmm.
were known all over Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Alfonso El Savio mentions them,
Mm-hmm.
Dante mentions them, Brunetto mentions them,
Mm-hmm.
because the matter of Britain, the Arthurian matter,
Mm-hmm.
like the matter of France about Charlemagne and so
Mm-hmm.
forth.
Mm-hmm.
These were the oral stories all over Europe,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which were our identity stories.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Mm.
And I think, but I hope someday you will also study Australian Aborigine material.
You know, Julia, ever since you first told me about the I think the
The
how was it,
creation.
the walkabout, right?
Yes,
And the
right.
and all of that, and the idea that they also have this notion of dream walkers and time collapsing
Yes.
in their spiritual quest. I've been fascinated by that, and as I write these stories, because I told you there are five of them planned,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
As I write them, each one focuses on, it's almost like a kaleidoscopic view. While
Hmm.
it's the same family, so there'll be a lot of incidences that recur, right, from one book to the next, but then they'll be happening from a different perspective.
Right.
So since in this book, since Maya is a dream walker and she has historical experiences, right? She has like the immediacy of historical experiences. It'll be interesting to see how Esther,
Yes.
whose role is as a memory keeper, right? So that she remembers the lives of all of her ancestors,
Right.
as if they were, and she remembers even their pains and their joys with the immediacy of first person experience, right? Just in her memory. So it'll be interesting, and as because it's what I'm writing right now, so I'm
Yes.
sort of
Right.
previewing to you what's coming, and I'll send you a copy as soon as it's ready, so you can read it. But it'll be interesting to then
Yes,
be
because
able to incorporate other perspectives,
it
because
could be done, because your compass
mhm,
maps the whole globe.
yes.
And I have a student. She's now in Bali.
Mhm,
She spent quite a lot of time in Australia. She
mhm,
showed up at the University of Colorado. Her father was working materials on Chaco Canyon, on
mhm,
the Native American ancient cultures with
mhm,
beautiful architecture in the rock buildings.
mhm,
And she was writing a senior thesis
mhm,
on the Hopi and the Navajo. And the professor of anthropology, was absolutely beastly to her. And it was a ghastly oral exam. And I was,
mhm,
one of the professors present.
mhm,
And, and I said at the end of it, this was just a appalling, because he was saying how awful the Native Americans are. The Navajo have too much sheep, and so on and so forth. Criticizing, completely unable, as he should have as an anthropologist, to even enter into their reality, to understand it. So I suggested to her that she do, because I was also working with another student who was doing wonderful broadcasts and very creative. And so we did a broadcast which we called Mandela, where we had, she did one on the Aborigines, she did one on the Native Americans, and so on. So it was 4 different cultures given equal time in a kind of democracy. And she was using the Aborigine music and so on. So she was introducing me to aspects I didn't know. And then I finally got to Australia and met with the Aborigine. And it was a wonderful encounter, because we were talking about trauma.
Right.
On culture clashes and so forth. I was amazed that they accepted me and gave me, musical instruments which can only be seen by women.
Right. Wow.
With the women at the mill, you just get the feet, and this symbolizes the 2 women, and so on. But I think it's possible for you in this book to do a similar global
And I envision actually co-writing it with individuals from within the cultures that these dream walks happen. So if Esther has a memory of her ancestors, and some of her ancestors are dream walkers, that's one way for her to enter into their experience of dream walking.
Right.
And there are more dream walkers than just Olo and João de Sousa and Maya, right? There are dream walkers. One of the dream walkers is actually Afonso, the emperor. Do I have this right? Afonso II. Do I have that right? I'm sorry. I was just writing it yesterday. So now my mind has gone blank.
It does.
Exactly. And I'm curious. I'm really curious about whether some other figures will show up as dream walkers. But I don't know yet.
You're writing this and allowing it to tell you what to write.
Yes, exactly. Because here's what's really funny, Julia. I thought, and I know this is going to sound completely absurd, but I really thought Dante was going to show up in one of Maya's dream walks.
Yes.
And he just never did.
Because he's doing a dream walk.
And given how prominent he is in my mind, right? I thought, well, he never showed up. What happened? Where is he? So I know. So I don't know if he's ever going to show up. I doubt it. Like right at this point, I doubt it. In the 5 volumes, in the 4 volumes to come, I doubt it. But then there are other figures who are not so well known, who are showing up, in Esther's lived memory. Esther, being a memory keeper, is also a storyteller, right? And so a lot of her storytelling is sort of molding these dream walks as stories rather than as things that have an immediate effect on her perception of the world the way they do for Maya, But you're absolutely right in that it would be wonderful to work with storytellers from different parts of the world and have that first person account from them. And this is why I say I want to co-write it with someone, because I don't, I think it's important that, for example, if I work with an Aborigine poet, I want it to be their voice that comes through the story, right? And so the cover of the book would say Adoyo and the name of, the other storyteller, right? So that this is not a proprietary thing of this is my authorship, but rather these are storytellers coming together to bring into the world, certain stories. This is my dream, right? And I hope it comes to pass, but one never knows, right?
He's in touch with Leslie Silke.
Okay.
She did this wonderful paper at Harvard before she became the famous writer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on the importance of storytelling. It was a wonderful presentation.
Mm-hmm. Does she have it written or published somewhere?
Yes, I published it in our book on Apuleius.
Okay.
Which I think you must get your hands on it.
Okay. I'll look for it and I'll get for it.
It is an African writer, and then at the end of it we have a penitente woman telling her story. We have Leslie Silke telling her story. We have a English gypsy orphan telling her story. All people I met and knew, and I gathered the stories together. And I was saying in the book, yes, you've got all of these scholars with their essays in the front of it, but the storytelling by, in the case of the gypsy woman and of the penitente women, were voices that normally would not get heard, but are extremely important.
Right.
Much deeper than the academics can afford to be. I wanted to go back to Philip II because in his bedroom, this connection between the Netherlands and Spain got Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights.
I have it in mind, yes.
Which is an extraordinary painting. The naked bodies, black and white, and the various positions they're in.
Even in the most irreverent positions.
I know. And he builds this very austere monastery, the Escorial, where I've gone to research the Latino manuscript and so forth. And but it's an amazing place. It is a fortress. And, also the kinds of paintings these tyrants placed in their bedrooms. I've got up here The Island of the Dead by Arnold Berkelin, because he buries his baby daughter here, and then he paints this obsessively 5 times. It was Hitler's favorite painting in his bedroom.
Oh gosh.
Which is German tourists come here because of that. And the English tourists don't know that side of the story of the cemetery, the symmetry with the cypress trees and the gondola, because Berkelin does a kind of dream walking, and he's using the cemetery's hill, but also San Michele in Venice with the gondola with the coffin sailing through the waters. Freud was fascinated with this painting, and also Gabriel D'Annunzio and so forth.
Well, I can believe.
But I think in these paintings, whether it's Hieronymus Bosch or Arnold Berkelin, you're going into dream time, and it's a world, a fantasy world.
I want to
time and space.
I want to share with our viewers right now that image so they can see. Oh, if I can get the computer to cooperate. Let me see, just so they can see very quickly the Garden of Earthly Delights. I think this is the one that I want to show. Wait, is that the one I want to show? Which one do I want to show?
I can try to see if I can get the Island of the Dead for you.
Okay.
I'm not sure. No, I can't.
It's called The Island of the Dead. Maybe I can find it on here too.
Right.
Okay, there we go. So
yes, that is
like that's the one
of your book. And It's an amazing painting.
And let me put it full screen so people might see it better. There we go.
Mm.
So can you, if you just walk our, can you walk us through this a little bit?
Yes, it is rain.
Let me see if I can, I'm going to take this out. There we go. So now we're seeing just a picture.
Yes.
And
but it's an extraordinary painting to have in your bedroom. It's sort of your dreams.
So Philip II had this in his bedroom, you said?
And I've never quite understood why Hieronymus Bosch was painting these.
Let's see. Why does everyone look like they're hatching out of some kind of an egg? You know?
And then I don't know. Yes.
The Garden of Earthly Delights. This is so interesting. So, am I right in? I don't know. Can you see my mouse moving over?
Yeah, you've got your creation of Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve.
Serpent's becoming the first woman. And then
oh, look at all these animals here. You have elephants and giraffes and
savanna. Yeah.
all these animals in the savannah. This is fascinating. And then what do we have up here? Do you know? Can you see clearly? I wish I could see it more clearly. But the screen I'm working with is very small, and I don't think it wants me to expand the picture anymore.
Yeah, I think we can just let people
go
find
look at this. Okay, so I'll put a link to this so they might have a look at it. Yeah. And so you're saying that Philip II had this in his bedroom, and it is an odd sort of thing to. I don't. Well, why do we think that it's odd that he had this in his bedroom? Like, why? What does that mean to you that he had this in his bedroom?
Miss Goose, I didn't catch the word you used.
I said, why is it odd to you? Like, why is it significant to you that this was in his bedroom?
Well, quite clearly he was very attracted to it, the way Hitler was attracted to the Island of the Dead. And it is an amazing painting. Why did it get painted? I mean, it's extraordinary scenes. It doesn't come out of the traditional iconography of Christian art. It's this extraordinary celebration of naked human bodies, which you also do get in the manuscript, miniatures of Dante, because the cells are naked. They're not clothed. And the observation of the shapes of the bodies, they are beautiful in this painting. And then you've got all of the nightmare going on the hellish side. There you do have the tradition of the right side being good, the left side being evil.
And yet, here's what's really fascinating to me, Julia. It's fascinating to me that on this, on the right side of the painting, with the dark background, right, you do have these fairly horrific looking images, like the ears with the knife coming out of it. But you also have all these technological elements that you don't have in the other sections, right? The other sections are naturalistic, whereas here you have not only the technological instruments, but you also have musical instruments, which are like man-made, man-made things. For you have what looks like a clock or a shield. I can't quite tell what that is.
And the bagpipes and all kinds of
things. So what does it say that, and you have these human figures in fairly sad looking circumstances. They're not as celebratory or healthy looking as in the other sections, no matter how surreal the other sections are. It's just that this is the section that is full of human technology, right?
Yes.
And I wonder what that signifies.
infernal landscape of industrialization, isn't it? The instruments that man makes. In medieval music theory, the best music is beyond the physical instruments. And but it is amazing.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, are you able to find the Island of the Dead?
I can look for it. Let's see. So
I don't know how to do the split screen, the share screen. I could
Island of the
try.
Dead.
I think I'm probably blocked from doing the share screen.
Island of the Dead. This is a painting, right? Okay, so let me see. Isle of the Dead. Okay, so is this there's a Basel version and New York version?
That's right. He
And then
painted
there's
5 versions of Cecil.
1883. Okay.
The Basilea one, I think, is probably the best one at the moment to show.
Okay. Wow, this is amazing. There's
And it is water.
Okay, so let me see. So there's Basel. Oh no, wait, hang on. So there's 1880, May 1880, June 1880, 83, 84, and 86. So let me see if I can open them up in different windows. That way we can look through them individually. Okay.
He's Swiss, and he painted it here in Florence.
Okay. So I'm gonna share the screen for that one. Oh, my computer is very, very not stop screen. It was screen. What was the stop screen sharing? Screen sharing. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to share again, but this time it's going to be the first 1880 version.
Okay.
Gosh, this. Okay. Chrome tab.
I think in the other you were getting into the mind of Philip II. In this one you're getting into the mind of Hitler. There you are.
Okay, this is the one.
Right.
So tell us about this one.
Well, here you get the symmetry, the cypress trees, the gondola with the white coffin, because she was just a 7-month-old child. She's sort of like Alex. She doesn't make it. Maria Anna. And I've got the archival documents where we buried her here. The tomb is now lost, but she was never exhumed. So we know she's here somewhere.
And she's the artist's child?
She's his daughter, yes. And so that her dying really had this very strong effect on him. And he kept painting this painting over and over again. And it is dream work. It's a composite of Ischia, the Swiss who has all of the archives on Berkeley in Basilea. He's very literal minded. He says, no, this is only one place. It isn't all of these places. It isn't San Michele. It isn't this cemetery. It's just Ischia. And I've been trying to say to him, but in your dreams, you mix landscapes. Dante does that. We do. We recreate architectural buildings and landscapes. But he can't see that. He's very left-brained about it. But it's fascinating that painting should have created such an obsession for both the artists and for the owners of it. One of the 5 was destroyed in the war, so we've only got 4 left.
I think the 4th one is the one that was destroyed because all I could find was a black and white photograph of it. Let me see. Let me roll through the
others. Yes.
Yeah. Let me see. This is I can show the others as well if I have them in the right order. Let me see if I have them in the right. Do I have them in the right order? I think so. Okay. Well, I have to remember. So here's the second one. Oh, if my computer wasn't so temperamental, I could, let's see, can I just change this? So stop. Okay, so I'm going to do this again. Oh, jeez. Sorry. This computer is incredibly temperamental. I cannot get the... Okay, there we go. All right, so here we go. So I have to do these one at a time. And I believe...
Don't worry.
No, it's okay. It's this is actually really cool. Okay, here we go. Here's the second one. It's apparently at the New York Metropolitan Museum.
Right, right.
If I could show all of them, I would. And then here's a second one.
And then, of course, Sergei Rachmaninoff writes the music for this. So also, and the music, I don't like playing it too often because it's somber.
Is he writing it because he recognizes the sort of the elegiac nature of the story? Yes. Okay.
And in the music, he's getting the lapping of the water.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to show the next one, which I think is the third one.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm getting good at this. Hang on. There we go. I like that we have the time that we can sort of, take our time and go through this. Now, do I... Maybe... I hope this is the right one. This may be the last one.
One of them is very small.
I don't know if this is the last or second to last one.
Yes. And here you also see how he's playing and shifting its forms and so forth.
And the light is very different.
Yes.
The light is extremely different.
Mm-hmm.
I have the advantage of being able to flip from one image to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So that, oh gosh, I really wish we could show people this. This is really fascinating because as I'm going from one to the next, like I go from the first one where the structures, the man-made structures, are painted differently.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The cypress trees are like the relationship of the rock to the cypress trees is similar, and then the approaching boat with the come si dice la, the coffin, I suppose, on it. That's all similar because they all seem to be a standing figure and a rowing figure and the white box.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
But the structure, the building structure, these look different from each other.
Yes.
The rocks look different, and
right.
And it seems like either an image born of imagination or trying to find different permutations for a frame, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
This is so fascinating. So while we're talking, I'll shift from this one to the next one, and hopefully, if you pay attention to, I'm saying this for the benefit of people who watch this later.
Right.
Pay attention to.
Find you if I
this is different and this is different. I think the next one will look very, very unusual. Yeah. Let's see.
Okay.
And here's the last one, which is Leipzig. Oh goodness! Come on, computer.
To pull up on my other computer. The music.
Okay.
It begins very quietly. But it's maybe if I go a little bit further in, it's.
I can sort of hear it. And here's the last one.
Ah, jolly good. Right. Is the music coming through on your side?
I am hearing it. Yes. It's obviously it's a little bit distorted because of the
right. This is the recording of when Rachmaninoff himself conducted it. And, so that, I mean, I think we do need to talk more about why the arts are dream work. Call upon parts of our brain that are outside of time and space to, in a sense, they are our therapies. They are. I'm going to turn this off now.
Oh yes, please, because I was having trouble hearing you. Please continue.
Okay. The Navajo sun paintings. They do the creation of the world, and they bring in the name of the patient who needs to be healed within the context of the entire cosmos. And it is the mandala, the four quarters, and so on and so forth. And then after the sun painting is finished, it's obliterated. It's a temporary thing. But it's the dream work to heal the patient. And also, for instance, Greek theatre, the Pideveros. There was only a hospital and a theatre. There was no town there. People came by boat to be healed. And I think we've lost sight with the sort of, when we read a novel, we lose ourselves into it as if it's a dream. But we sort of think of it as being logical reality. In Greece, classical Greece, in Athens, if you were a criminal and you committed a crime and you wanted to get off the hook when you were tried in the agora, in the marketplace, you would hire a logographer, someone who would train you to give your speech in your defense, in which you lie, but you make your lies seem the truth. So it has to be very much in the realm of space and time. And this was despised. This is the wrong kind of writing. And the other kind of writing, which is the allegorical, the moral, and so forth. Dante's playing both games. Characters he creates, characters like those in the world of the logographers in the agora. Allegory means away from the agora.
Oh.
The marketplace. And you're doing both. And the Western world is locked into time and space too much. And I think that's why there's a kind of rebellion against it. Latin workers not showing up on time and so forth. Irish servants who break the crockery and so because they're in systems of injustice. So they smash it up, or, delay it and so forth. And I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, I'm following. I'm following you.
But I found in my own life working on Dante enormously therapeutic.
Yeah.
And he intends it to be that. It's the own therapy which he shares with the reader. I sense this is what you're doing in your book.
May I share that, what you just said about, the Western conception of history being locked in sort of set in stone, as it were.
Yes.
This in rain finds its expression in all these stone monuments, right?
Yes.
Everywhere you find a supposedly historically significant figure, they're somehow encoded in stone, starting with Vasco da Gama, and then the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, the what is it called, the Monument of Discoveries, that huge world map that is created with tessellated stone.
Yes.
And then followed by, if I can remember I'm trying to do the thing that you did with the water to see if I can remember the stone elements. Things like Hera's visit to the cathedral, right? And seeing these cathedrals, which are on the one hand, they're supposed to be the house of worship, the house of God, right? And yet they're built in ways that mimic the natural house of God, which is forests, right? So they mimic and stylize a natural forest. And the curious thing, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, Julia. I've had it in cathedrals, and I've also had it at Grand Central Station, i.e., large spaces where there are lots of people. And if you listen closely to the sound that's produced from people walking around and talking to each other, they're not distinctly identifiable sounds of feet or voices. Rather, they sound like forest sounds, right? The kind of rumbling and mumbling that you'd hear if you're sitting still in a forest, right? Now, I spent a lot of time in forests when I was a child, both when I was in boarding school in Kenya and when I was in boarding school here in the United States, because I went to boarding schools that were in forested or, sort of rural areas. And so I remember the very first time I felt at home in the city was when I was standing in a church and I heard that sound. When I heard the sound of the forest produced by the rumble of people mingling about. So in rain, where you have these moments of history or historically significant things set in stone, the one iteration of that you have in the oral tradition is when Luanda Magere is transformed into a boulder. But that's not a story that's told in rain, right? That's a story that'll be told elsewhere. I told it to you guys when we were talking about book 2. But I do remember wondering why that story wasn't making it into rain. There's all kinds of allusions to it. In fact, his wife is stoned, or Olo witnesses the stoning of Luanda Magere's wife against this boulder, but he doesn't actually witness the battle where Luanda Magere turned into a boulder, right? And then there's also later on, there's also in Alex's readings about history, I know what it is. When Esther is telling Hera about the joys of being in primary school, because Hera is really looking forward to going to primary school. All of her siblings are already in primary school, and she feels left out or was having to stay behind in kindergarten. But when she's ready to enter standard 1, which is the first grade, Esther kind of tells her about the great things about primary school. Like they have nap time and they have all this. No, they don't have nap time anymore, but they do have storytelling time. And it's called history class, right? Except they're the stories of people who've been turned into stone, right? Like history class is essentially stories of people like kings and queens who've been turned into stone. And then I think there's a mention of how Queen Victoria, when she dies, the craftsmen of her land turned her into stone as well. And so it's interesting when you talk about sort of Western culture being sort of like set in its ways. This, I think, manifests in the petrifying of everything. And bring it into our contemporary experience, like what's going on in current events.
Yes.
A little while after Rain came out, which was April 15th, I think in May, at the end of May, toward the end of May is when George Floyd was murdered, right?
And the destruction of the statues.
Exactly. And all over the world, people sort of rose up, bringing down not only Confederate statues in the United States, basically statues of slaveholders and people who championed slavery, but also in Europe of slave traders, right? Of people who were essentially tyrants and terrorists against the humanity of others. And I found that really, really interesting, because in presenting Vasco da Gama and Camões as stone figures, like venerated stone figures of Portuguese culture and history, and then later in book 7, essentially bringing these venerated figures down.
Yes.
The same exactly the same process was sort of unfolding in the book, and it really surprised. I just thought, I really thought, Julia, given before May 25th, I thought to myself, this book is going to land really poorly with the public, because it essentially because it is tearing down stone statues, right? It is saying that these people who are set up on pedestals are just rock, right? They're not
yes.
They're not vital. They're not the living essence of. They're simply commemorations of something that's actually quite horrific. And then counterpose that with the kinds of histories that you get through the oral tradition, which are histories that have to be breathed. They're not histories that are set in dead texts that then have to be encountered and enlivened by a reader, but rather they're spoken from one person to another, and through this speaking and hearing, they remain alive in the transmission, and their life is only jeopardized by silencing, right? The moment someone stops sharing with another, the moment someone stops listening to another. And so that part of it, that part of your comment is really fascinating to me. I'm still really curious about, when we go into like our field, our formal field of scholarship, what really fascinates me is how scholarship ignores the vitality of literature. There's a debate going on right now with a group that I'm involved with, and in my mind, it has to do with recognizing where the primary text we deal with came from. The way academia is set up, academia would take Dante and filter Dante through boxes. Well, here's the thing. Filter Dante through the lens of Boccaccio and all the subsequent other commentators. And then academia's job becomes how to make Dante fit, let's say, De Sanctis. Do you know what I mean? How to make Dante fit. I don't want to use a living critic right now because I don't want to get myself in trouble. But how to make Dante fit Singleton, right?
That's why we call our project Dante Vivo.
There you go.
Giovanni Pacini's title.
Exactly. And so the problem for me is that so much academia is about that. It's like, well, if it doesn't agree with Singleton, if Dante's text doesn't agree with Singleton, or if Dante's text doesn't agree with De Sanctis, as examples, then there's something wrong with Dante's text. Rather than saying, well, no, actually Singleton missed something, or the scientists missed something. It's backwards, completely backwards.
Yes.
And they forget that Dante did not write the Commedia for De Sanctis and for Singleton. But well, he did for them, but not in the sense of in their capacity as scholars who are going to commentate on it. He didn't write the Commedia for erudite, staid, starched, academicians who would say blah, 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 blah,
Yes.
He was operating, even on a broader sense, he was operating outside the institution, right? He was operating in ways that were contrary to institutionally authorized norms.
Yes.
So much so that even his contemporaries were like, oh man, this is not going to work because you're not following the rules that the institution set. I mean, Giovanni del Virgilio says as much to him. You really should have written this in Latin because nobody's going to pay attention to it after the fact. And it was like, my friend, just let it be, right? I love his answer. It's so casual and yet so erudite at the same time when he says, well, you know what? It is what it is, right? Machiavelli was not writing for the institution. In fact, it was contra institution. Boccaccio wasn't writing for the institution. They were not writing in ways that conformed to the parameters framed by institutional norms.
Yes.
And so it constantly confounds me that academia keeps forgetting that. They keep forgetting that the primary texts that they deal with are not supposed to be pressed and shoved into the limited.
This is what I'm grappling with our reading group, because one of our members, she is a professor of literature, and she gets so upset because I refuse to allow them to begin with the boring commentary. I say, no, do the text first, and then we see what we can see. And I get into trouble because I say, really, look, Dante is an exile. If you were exiled, you were also excommunicated. And there he is, the outlier, writing lay theology of the highest level, better than the academicians. And he's putting in all of the wonderful oppositions, Siger, Brabant, and so forth. And I also say, look, Dante shows himself committing all of the 7 deadly sins. And you do it with him, perhaps through the reader, to experiencing each one of these sins. How Francesca, come morto cade, and so forth. He's playing the same game that Carlo Collodi did with Pinocchio. Pinocchio and Dante, Dante in the text. Dante is, he's behaving like a donkey. And people can't cope with this because they're used to the statue in Santa Croce. Where And I keep saying, see the laughter in the text. See the games he's playing. These are wonderful pedagogical games. Because medieval pedagogy knew that you can teach through laughter.
Yes, and through humility. May I elaborate an idea with you for a second, Julia, about humility in Dante?
Yes.
So there's a conventional idea that Dante is arrogant, and self-aggrandizing, especially as a narrator, when he talks about not only the difficulty of writing the text, but then demonstrates his ability to effectuate these difficult tasks. And there are 2 places that people usually point to when they want to indict him for arrogance. The first place is when in Limbo,
intelligences, right?
Yes, exactly. When he says, and I became the 6th amongst these great poets, which include Homer, Ovid, Lucan, Virgil, and I forgot the last one. Homer,
Statius isn't there because he's going to meet.
no, not Statius. It's Homer, Virgil, Lucan, Ovid, and
Virgil,
Horace.
Horace.
Horace. Okay, so
Yes.
these 5 poets are there, and then he says, you know, I once of it welcome among them. He says, and I was 6th amongst these illustrious souls, right? So that's the first place people point to. The second place people point to, among others, is I think in Paradiso, when he is concerned about, you know, his poem making it into posterity's attention. Like if this poem should ever gain the attention of posterity and then bring me honor, etc., etc. Well, here's where I depart from the conventional wisdom that, especially the first one and also the second one, are evidence of his hubris. When, as a student, my advisor brought me into the company of other established Italian, like professional Italian scholars, professional Dante scholars, during this conference that was held here in Washington, D.C. several years ago. I was here as a graduate student, so I was still a student, right? And I had just begun writing my dissertation. So I was still uncertain about how to formulate my arguments. I was still uncertain about how to do the basic interrogations I needed to do, right? So it was still very new. And I was casting my net about, trying to zero in on the most meaningful form of the question I wanted to ask. The basic question was, is it possible to articulate a structure of the commedia that is comprehensive and rational, right? So I needed to interrogate different avenues to whittle it down to a focused question that I could actually address in a concrete way. So you can imagine that phase of investigation when you're still formulating the questions, it's very, very precarious. This was the stage I was in. Now, I started with some insight, right? Something that I thought was really beautiful. I'd shared it with my advisor, and he was excited about it too. He warned me repeatedly not to get carried away, right? Not to let myself get too caught up in questions that I couldn't answer. So I always had that, if you will, you know, that guide reminding me to stay on the narrow path, right? And not just dissipate. Okay, so that was the sort of the context in which I was there as a student. The rest of the members of the conference, again, it was a 3-day conference, all on Dante, and all the presenters were professors, like tenured professors, senior members of the discipline. And I was one of 3 students that this professor, who was my advisor, had sponsored to come to this event, right? So realizing that I was one of a very small number of students among all these greats, right? I naturally felt very, very small and very humbled, not in a negative way, but just cognizant of the fact that I was a child among giants, right?
Right.
And
on the giant's shoulder sees father.
There you go. And so here we are in this context, and I stayed by my advisor the whole time, right? For all 3 days, I sat with him the whole time. At one point during one of the breaks, he was asking me how my dissertation was going, and of course, I just described the situation, so I felt a little bit self-conscious and a little bit embarrassed. And I said, well, you know, it's coming. And then he had to excuse himself because he saw another colleague from another illustrious university a little bit a ways. So he excused himself and he went to talk to her, right? And there I was left like with my wine glass and my cheese just go, you know, sort of dangling there. And at a certain point, after speaking with her for a while, I see them both turn to me, and he beckons me over, right? And so I go and join them. And this is what he says. Introducing me to her. He says, I'd like you to introduce you to Adoyo. She's a wonderful student. She has some amazing ideas about Dante, and she's definitely one to look out for. I was thinking to myself, but he knows the uncertain and precarious state of my dissertation. How can he possibly tell that there's anything promising in this? And yet he was presenting me with such a generosity of spirit, right? With such a broadness of almost paternal care to this individual in the most generous light. I mean, generous keeps coming up. That I remember thinking to myself, this is amazing. Like, he gains absolutely nothing. There's nothing that benefits him it doesn't benefit him anyway to do this for me. Because at this stage, who knows, I may end up not ever doing anything meaningful. And yet he presents me in such a way to this person that her eyes lit up and she looked forward to meeting me. And Julia, this is when I had the insight. Dante has presented to us throughout, not only throughout Limbo, right? Because Limbo is essentially a catalog of literary, historical, philosophical works of every discipline, right?
Yes.
Of the seven liberal arts, medicine, music, philosophy.
They're the book people.
Exactly, but not just there, right? He presents more of these bibliographies in Canto 13, right? Of Inferno. He presents even more of them in, most explicitly at the top of Purgatorio, when he presents the books of the Bible, right, in that procession, right?
Yes, and they're wonderful in Purgatorio, in the procession.
And then he presents even more of them yet in Canto 10, 11, and 12 of Paradiso, right? When you get all the theologians and philosophers and mystics and what have you. And these are not the only places where they're presented, but these are some of the biggest sort of libraries, if you will, of bibliographies. And in my conception, sorry?
Remember that medieval books always begin with the author portrait. And the author portrait is the voice of the book.
Yes, there you go.
The book and the person are one.
And when that,
so what Dante is doing, he's meeting with all of the book people, all of the books in his library.
And check this out. Here's the thing.
And he's creating of them his book person.
Well, here's the thing, Julia. If you think about it in terms of rhetorical figures, he has essentially distilled them down to metonymy, right? So that the figure of Virgilio represents all of the body of work of Virgil. The figure of Homer represents all of the body of work of Homer, and yet they represent them in anthropomorphic metonyms, so that he gets to interact and speak with them and what have you. So with that in mind, these 6 poets, or these 5 poets that Dante is presenting with us, are the principal poets, right, from whom he draws his expertise and experience as a poet.
And he becomes a 6th
But no, not yet. Let's not go there yet. Let's just understand the dynamics here. So first and foremost, they are the fountains. They're his teachers, right? And in having them, and the gesture is so specific. Dante is so meticulous in the way he presents. He doesn't just show up among them. They invite him to join them. And that invitation is not an invitation to greatness. No, it's not the way people think. It's not an invitation to now count yourself among... Exactly. It's not an invitation to count yourself among the greats as Homer and Lucan, but rather it's an invitation to partake of what they have to offer, to learn from it, and from there to develop his art, because he's a mere neophyte. He's a student. He doesn't know anything yet. And I thought to myself, based on how I was feeling about what my professor said, I thought to myself, this is what a good guide does. A good guide welcomes you into their company and says, in our company, there's so much you can learn if you so wish. Welcome and partake. And this, I could not think of a more beautiful way to pay homage to his teachers than to acknowledge their generosity. The fact that they are offering themselves freely, unconditionally, right? There is no price of admission. There's simply the desire to partake. If anything, theirs is a gift of grace. Yes. And so I think to myself, the ungenerous reader will think that Dante is being self-aggrandizing by including himself among these poets. But I think if you read closely the way he presents the dynamics, this is Dante saying, I knew nothing before this point. My guide is leading me to the fountains where I might learn, right? And
where he had learned,
where the poet had learned, but where the pilgrim has yet to learn. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so he's leading me where I've yet to learn as a pilgrim. And from them, I will then develop this. And every time he meets this library of anthropomorphic and metonyms, there is something in the text that tells you what it is that he has learned from them, right? In Canto 13, there are all these rhetorical details that remind you, like, ooh, this is rhetorically reminiscent of Pier delle Vigne. This is rhetorically reminiscent of Brunetto Latino. This is rhetorically reminiscent of this or that and the other person. When we get to the Bible, right, when we get to Purgatorio, the most fascinating, I'm sorry, I'm so excited now that I'm yelling. Can you hear me clearly without my,
yes.
All right, great. When we get to Purgatorio, right, and you have the whole procession of the Bible before you, and the idea that the Bible has sort of a self-exegetic mechanism, right, which is, all the different iconographic images, the griffin, the candles, exactly all of those, which in and of themselves are built-in exegetic mechanisms of the Bible, right? He then gives you an example of how that exegetic mechanism works in the most beautiful, and I think one of the most sorely misunderstood passages, right? Where people take that as yet another example of Dante's hubris. When, in describing the four creatures, right, he says that in Ezekiel, they look like this. They have four wings. But in John, they have 6 wings. And the way he frames it, like, I saw these 6 creatures with 6 wings, which also appear to Ezekiel. But in this case, John is with me, right? And everybody, including Robert Hollander, throws their hands up and goes, oh my God, the hubris of Dante. How could he decide that he's one to arbitrate whether Ezekiel or John is right? And I think to myself, are you not paying attention to the way he said it? He didn't say, I'm with John. He said, John is with me, i.e., John can attest to the truth of what I saw. And you wonder to yourself, well, how does this work into the self-exegetic mechanism of the Bible? Why? Because if we look at the Bible, he's using Ezekiel specifically, who's a prophet, right? And John specifically, who's also a prophet, right? And a prophet specifically of Revelation, both of them prophets of Revelation. But where Ezekiel is sort of prophecy or sort of revelation in prophecy, revelation as yet unrealized, right? John is revelation actualized, because John's revelation comes after the coming of Christ, after the sacrament, after all of that. Therefore, it makes sense that a prophet who can only see through a glass darkly, right, like Ezekiel, who did not have all the mechanisms of revelation, would only account for an approximation of what that revelation looks like. John, however, has the benefit of clarity because his revelation comes after the coming of Christ. And so he sees more clearly. So it makes sense, even if only chronologically, that Dante, who lives 1300 years after John's revelation is written down, is seeing the same thing the way John saw it. And therefore, he can attest to John by saying, John is actually the one who gives an accurate account of what I saw, right? And I'm thinking to myself, like, this is really a beautiful thing where, when you think Old and New Testament, what's the relationship to each other? Dante encapsulates it with that small scene where he says, Old Testament told us what we might look for. New Testament tells us what it actually means, how it actually is. And so I'm always left flabbergasted when critics get caught up.
Oh, they're so literal.
In the idea that, and then they take Dante's assertions personally in the most negative ways. They don't give him the benefit of the doubt.
No.
They don't allow that what he's saying may actually mean more than one thing. And this is where, as you're speaking about the tricks that Dante plays. I know you always say he plays tricks, or he's playing this, and from my perspective, I understand what you mean, but I don't see them as tricks. I see them as him opening doors that tell us that there's more to it than meets the eye, right? That what we were seeing was a trick, but we can actually clarify our vision.
Right. But there he is standing right beside Virgil.
Mm-hmm.
And he's told, he plucks the twig
of
the tree.
Uh-huh.
And it bleeds and speaks. Now, he ought to have known not to have plucked that twig, because that's already there with the tree that is Polydorus in Virgil's text.
But how would he know? But how would he know?
Well, he's meant to have read Virgil, be reading Virgil.
No, yes, he is. Yes, he is. But think about the context.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But think about the context in which they arrive there, right?
And all your thoughts will prove defective.
And we know, like, you're right. You're absolutely right in that. Dante, when he first meets Virgil, he tells him, "Oh, I studied your volume, thoroughly, and I love you, and you're my maestro, my maestro, my autore." So here's a student who's gushing, right?
Yes.
And fanboying all over Virgilio, letting you know, "Oh, I love you to heaven and back," So you're absolutely right in the sense of, okay, maybe he ought to have known, but the truth of it is, nobody can have perfect knowledge. Mm-hmm. And this is revealed in the idea that Dante, pilgrim, when he's told to pluck this, he doesn't have the wisdom or the foresight to think, oh, this is reminiscent of Polydorus. He does not know that. There's nothing in the context to hint that to him. Even though he hears cries, he doesn't know where they're coming from. There's nothing at all. It's only after he has plucked it that he realizes, oh shit, what did I do? You know what I mean? And that's when he realizes that it's associated with the idea of Polydorus. And I think
with him.
Exactly. And this is where Virgil
get tricked.
Exactly. And it's Virgil who's playing the trick, not Dante.
Yeah.
You follow me?
I think in a way we need to look at Dante as we do at Pinocchio. They're tricks to savior figures.
Mm-hmm.
They trick us in order to teach us, to save us.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Please define for me what you mean by the word trick, because I don't know if I'm understanding you correctly. When you use the word trick, what do you mean by that word?
Well, that was a trick. I can remember my brother telling me to pick up this electric wire, which was live.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And the electric shock went all around me.
Oh.
That was a trick, being told to pick it up.
No, but the trick your brother played on you caused you harm.
Right.
Or in some way ridiculed you, or somehow lowered you.
Yes, Dante does it in play, so it doesn't harm you if you learn not to do it a second time.
This is why I have trouble with the word trick, because it seems to me that these are pedagogical exercises.
Yes.
They're lessons rather than tricks.
Right.
You follow me? No,
I mean, I used to love if I had a student who fell asleep in my lecture, I might go up to the student and say, "Awak," straight out of Chaucer, just to to be playful about it. But I think what Dante is doing is tricking you into being in the text he's playing with. And it's complicated, but
no, I do follow you. I do understand. It's just that
for instance,
I'm still stuck on the word trick. I feel like trick implies deceit. No. Trick implies deceit of some kind, right? It
well,
implies sort of
the burnt child fears the fire. If you taught the child there's danger here, by allowing it safely to get into a bit of danger in order not to repeat it in the future. I love the scene where Dante plays off Luke 24 with Statius,
remind me of Luke 24, which
who's
is
praising Virgil and doesn't realize he's in
ah.
Virgil's presence.
Oh yes, oh my God, I love that scene. I love that. Oh, I love. It's one of the funniest. It's one of the funniest moments of the comedy. I remember once I was in the library and I'd read it dozens of times before, but I don't know what it is about the convergence of elements in that moment. I get to the moment where Dante is eager to tell Statius, "Oh, you're talking about him," and Virgil is giving him that look of no, don't say anything exactly. And so Dante is like, "Oh crap! Okay, I shouldn't say anything, but I really, really want to." And then finally, Virgil concedes. It's like, "Okay, fine, you can tell him, right?" But I started laughing like a mad woman, and the librarian goes, "Shh." Because of all the moments in the commedia, to me, that is the funniest. Like it is pure humor.
It's a lovely one.
It is pure, and it's completely silent humor because not a word is exchanged, right? It's just the thoughts that are flying between them. Anyway, please go on.
Yes, my dissertation, it actually went into free editions as a published book, and the cover is lovely because it's the sculpture on the road to Compostela, and it has Christ with the I've forgotten the word. He's got the cockle shell on his script, and then there is Cleophas pointing out to the sun. The sun is setting, and then behind him is this young person holding a book. That person is Luke, who is chided in the medieval version of the Emmaus story. The third unnamed pilgrim is the gospeler, who doesn't know at that point yet that he's on the road with Jesus. And Jesus scolds him, "Oh, fools, and slow of heart to believe," and so on and so forth. And then they recognize him in the breaking of bread. But the iconography of Dante, often he is holding the book of Virgil. And Virgil is beside him like Cleopas, he is Luke. And then eventually when he gets to the scene with Statius, come ne scriva Luca, as Luke wrote it.
Yes.
And this I've actually had my students at Princeton and elsewhere perform the Officium Peregrinorum, the 24 scene with the pilgrims, singing it in Gregorian chant. And I found that they were able to do it after 5 rehearsals, which was amazing.
That is amazing.
Benedictine chant master, teacher, and so forth. But it's Dante is using that as the pattern for his book, where he is playing the game of the Emmaus pilgrims, where he's both the author who knows it, the gospel, and he's also the pilgrim Luke.
Yeah. Know
it. And we also with him don't know it till he tumbles on the truth, and then we do too with him. And I think the Dante scholars are reading on one level.
Yeah.
They're not able to see these games that Dante is playing. But they're games that are completely out of monastic and pedagogy. It is with the oblates acting that play, being Jesus and so forth, who functions in the monastery as if he were Jesus. They're being allowed to play with the costumes of the pilgrims who live in the monastery and so forth. I just find that one of the problems is we don't go back into looking at the primary materials.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
And the music, he's citing the.
I agree 100%. If I may comment on another thing that you said earlier, right? Earlier you had mentioned how music in the Middle Ages, right? Music theory in the Middle Ages considered the abstraction much more
celestial.
Celestial and essential than the sort of the physical manifestation of music, which is like the sound waves that we hear and all that. The way this manifests in the Commedia is really fascinating, in that besides the allusions to the Ptolemaic conception of celestial harmony that you have in Paradiso, right? Every time he talks about like the Trinity that tempers and attunes the heavens, the one of the things that I found in my analysis of the structure of the poem is that the mathematical rationale that accounts for the canto lengths, right? Canto lengths, which all seem sort of arbitrary, right? Because they go 36, 136, 142, 136, and I think like 124, 115, and then there's one that's as long as 160, but it's the only one, and they just sort of, so they seem arbitrary, to the point that when Charles Singleton said that he noticed a certain symmetry of canto lengths in the middle of the poem, another critic or two other critics actually were vehemently, adamantly in disagreement, because they thought that Singleton was just seeing things, right? Just sort of making up a pattern that could have just as easily arisen randomly. Anyway, with that in mind, I did wonder to myself, okay, setting aside the patterns of how the canto lengths appear, what about the lengths themselves? Like, is there anything to account for how long each canto is? The reason why this is important is because in a poem that is 14,233 lines long, it absolutely fascinated me that in the line, so of that whole number, half of 14,233 is 7,116, right? 7116, which means that the leftover remainder one will be line 7117, right? So you have 7,160 on one side, 7,160 on the other, and the middle line is 7117, which, neither here nor there, although many people made a big deal of the fact that it's a palindrome, right? what fascinated me about that particular line, which is verse 125 of Purgatorio 17, right? So it's near the end of Purgatorio 17. Therefore, not obviously centered. Like you couldn't sort of narrow your way down and get the middle line of Purgatorio and say that's the middle line. It's not. The middle line of the poem is toward the end of Purgatorio. But what's fascinating about that line is that it is the one that it's in the middle of Virgilius' summary of the rationale of Purgatorio, right? There are 9 tercets from the end of Purgatorio, counting 9 backwards, where Virgil summarizes how Purgatorio is organized after he's given Dante this dissertation about love and free will, right? And the first of the 9 basically introduces a lesson, right? He says, now I'm going to tell you how all of this stuff I've just explained applies to how Purgatorio is organized. The second, so there's a first, and then the second, which is the first of the summaries, summarizes the first terrace. Tercet number 3 summarizes the second terrace, right? Its location, its rationale, its sinners. The fourth tercet summarizes the third terrace. Remember, there are 7 terraces, which means that the fourth terrace is the middle one, and that's the one where they are, right? So in this middle tercet of 9, right, what does Virgil do? In the first line, he says, that he summarizes and says, those are the 3 that you've just seen. Now I want you to turn your attention, this is the middle line, to that which you're about to see, final line, so that you may better understand for yourself. Yes. Right? So line 97117 basically said, this is what you've seen, turn your attention, anticipate what you're about to see. So rationally, he's flipped. In terms of scansion, technically, that line scans symmetrically, right?
Right.
And then in terms of, so we've had let me see, 4 terces before that, leading us up to the 5th one. Okay, so you can hold it, let me finish the summary. And then what happens in the next 4 tercets, right? Because we've had 4 and then there's a 5th, we have 4 more. What happens in those 4? This is where it becomes really, really interesting, because you'd anticipate, since he summarized terrace 1, 2, and 3, right? And then use this 4th one to flip our attention around, he would use the next 3 to summarize terrace at least 5, 6, and 7, right? Because we're in the terrace of sloth, and so it makes sense that he just kind of ignores it anyway. It doesn't matter. But Virgilio doesn't do that. He doesn't summarize 5, 6, and 7. He says something to the effect of, you need to pay attention because blah, 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 for the next 3 tercets. He's very vague and very generalizing about how Dante should pay attention so that he might better understand what is yet to come. And then you have the final tercet that closes the canto. And I remember when I was studying, thinking, why didn't Dante like make it perfectly symmetrical the way he has done before? Like, Virgil knew the structure of Inferno perfectly. Why isn't he giving us the structure of Purgatorio perfectly? And then I remembered, well, Virgil knows Inferno because of the Aeneid, right? This is terrain he has walked through before. From the beginning, we know that Purgatorio is a strange place to him. It's unknown to him. And as a rational thinker, he can summarize that which he has already seen, that which he has empirical experience of, but he cannot rationalize that which he has never thought of, seen, or understood. And so he can only very generally guide his student to keep his eyes open, right? And it's a brilliant teacher move to make, right? When the teacher doesn't know the answer and just says, okay, we need to look out for this, keep our eyes open, and remember everything we've learned so that it comes in handy, right, when the time comes. And to the pilgrim, it sounds like really sound advice. The narrator is sort of indifferent at this point, but you, the reader, you suddenly realize, wait a second, Virgil just pulled the best of all teacher rhetoric moves in not offering us an actual foreshadowing of what's to come, because he has no clue, but rather telling us to keep our eyes open, so that we better understand for ourselves, right? And so this is how Dante does this. Anyway, the point being that's the line that had me really hooked, because I thought, how in the world, over 20 years of composing this poem, is Dante aware that he's in the middle line? He's in the 7,117th line. The only thing that made sense to me was he had to have an efficient way of accounting for how far he had come. It would need to be an aggregate way, right? It couldn't be him counting 7,000 lines singly, right? It made sense to be able to like account for all of Inferno and say Inferno is this long, and then here are what the cantos of Purgatorio, this is how long they are. When I get to this certain point, I know I have to turn around, right? And I know that the rest of it is, the poem can only last another 7,116 lines. But how do you account for that? And this is when I realized, after a great deal of just deep analysis, a lot of number crunching, a lot of just sitting back and looking at the data, that Dante uses Boethian music theory to account for the length of each canto. And the result is that each canto length corresponds to a single note on the Guidonian scale. There are 13 notes in the Guidonian scale, right? No, not 13 notes. There are six notes on a Guidonian scale, but Dante uses 13 of them across 3 octaves, because the Guidonian scale is only 3 octaves. He uses 13 of them at a ratio of 3 to 4 to 6, which is itself a Ptolemaic ratio, right? And the end result, based on how the cantos occur, is a melody, which, get this, you're going to love this part, corresponds to the melody that's used on only 2 liturgical feasts. The Paschal feasts, it's used for different services during Eastertide. And Marian feasts, which celebrate the Assumption of the Virgin. This is the melody that Dante alludes to in the structure of the Commedia. I have published it.
Yes. Can I refer to it in Dante Vivo?
Oh, absolutely. I'll send you a link to the article. It's actually available on Biblioteca Dantesca. Yes,
because
yes.
I was working on the idea of the music of the spheres and so forth. And there are medieval cloisters where sculptures actually are also music like that. There's a wonderful, he was actually Minister of Culture in Romania. He wrote a book which got translated into Italian. It isn't into English. Gli occhi di Beatrice. And he describes how, not there, but when you get to Paradiso, Dante turns everything inside out. And this gets misinterpreted, and they just show a little thing at the top of the circle. And he says, no, it is the entire cosmos. And he does it beautifully with diagrams. But that's also what happens in the Vita Nuova. You are in this worldly sphere with these silly love songs, which are like the halls of the theatre in Boethius. He's sort of, courting Beatrice. And he's stalking her, and it's annoying her. Then she dies, and she becomes the Christ figure. And the whole poem palinodes on that. And that's what you're describing here.
Yeah.
The line is this is what I love about Dante. He plays games of being inadequate.
Yes.
That is the humility he's teaching us.
Yes, yes.
And
this is why the split between Dante author, Dante narrator, and Dante pilgrim works so well, because the pilgrim can be the ultimately most humble one. The narrator can be our companion guide, right?
Can also be fools at the same time. In fact, Virgil's name means he's the Falstaff to the pilgrim. He's in the wrong direction. He's the necromancer. Philosophy, not theology. And we fall in love with Virgil. He's actually the wrong guide for us. And we have to learn to, and also he has to learn his inadequacy in that.
Did you read?
These are the tricks I see Dante playing.
Did you read Mary Miliozzi's review of Rain?
No.
Mary actually finds, and this is one of those moments where I found myself, she and I had a conversation about this. Mary sees in Rain 3 figures that represent Dante, Virgil, and Beatrice. She sees Maya, who's the seeker, as Dante, right?
Yes.
She sees Mama Akoth as Beatrice, right?
Yes.
The one who sets the journey and guides and all that. And she sees Alex as Virgil. Alex is Virgil. Alex is the sort of the flawed, wise guide, right? Who goes missing, who in essence can only go so far.
That moment when she loses Alex, that is exactly like the loss of Virgil.
The loss of Virgil, yes. And the idea that Alex is quite sure,
knowing that.
No, this is the perennial question, isn't it? Did I write it knowing that? I don't think I was clever enough to know that. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't think I was clever enough to say, okay, I'm going to set this person up as the Virgil. I'm going to set this person up as a Dante.
You wouldn't if you had.
And I think part of the reason why it comes through and why someone who's familiar with Dante can see it is because my brain is saturated with Dante, right? Just as it's saturated with my great grandmother's sewing. So that's the language that comes out, right? Like the figurative language, the iconic language, and what have you. And here's something else that I noticed after Mary sent me a copy of her review. I hadn't noticed this, but it's so weird because anybody else reading this will go, well, how responsible are you for this book? Because you don't seem to have noticed a lot that was in it. I hadn't noticed, outside of things like there are 9 books, right? That a lot of things happen when these kids are 9 years old, right? Like a lot happens for Lo when he's 9 years old. Parallel, and Maya experiences parallel things when she's 9 years old, right? When he's 11 years old, when she's 11 years old, they have parallel experiences even across time. But I also noticed that Anatole Basile Tejo, his story starts when he's 9 years old, right? Because book 6 starts, 9-year-old Nato did not like his name, right? And the entire account of his 9th year gives you hints that he has some traits of a dream walker. You don't know why he has these traits. You find out later, right? Because he's the descendant of a dream walker, right? But 9-year-old Nato does not like his name, and then when he turns 10, that's when the francophonization of Nato begins. Up to that point, he's sort of an unspoiled, right? He's this unspoiled natural self, if you will. But once he turns 10 years old and is sent to the missionary school, then the missionary school starts molding him into the perfect Frenchman with books and texts and things that he loves doing, no doubt, right? But so this is one thing that I didn't notice. But the other thing that I found really interesting was Mama Akoth lives to be 111 years old, right? And I thought to myself, okay, so if you're going to draw parallels between Mama Akoth and Beatrice, right? Beatrice is a product of the Trinity, right? Which is which itself is a square of 9, and all of that thing that Dante goes through in Vita Nova. But I hadn't noticed that about Mama Akoth's age, that she lives to be 111 years old. And she serves, if I were to extend the metaphor or the parallels that Mary drew, Mama Akoth is not just Beatrice, she's also in effect Mary and Lucia, right? Because her work is that of teacher and guide and model and exemplar in so many different ways. Mary thought that Alex also in some ways embodied Beatrice in the extent that he was the figure that Maya kept looking for. He was the lost love that Maya was looking for. I haven't gotten a chance to really think through that one yet, but I like her configuration, her critical configuration of Maya as Dante, Alex as Virgil, and Mama Akoth as Beatrice, right? Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Really, really interesting. Well, my dear, it's almost 4:30.
It's certainly my pumpkin hour.
Your pumpkin hour is well over. This is so beautiful. You know what? I am spoiled by these talks because after we talk about rain for a little bit, we go into Dante, and I'm always so delighted about that.
I love these evenings. I
Me
look forward
too.
all week long.
Me too. Here's what I thought. I really liked your idea of dedicating some of these to just the commedia. And you had mentioned inviting Dennis Looney to maybe have a conversation with us.
I hope he will respond. I haven't got an answer to write.
Okay. And I thought that maybe we could talk about his book, Freedom Readers, because it's called Freedom Readers, right? Freedom Readers. Yes.
It's so topical, but he read.
Yes, exactly. And what I was hoping is because September 22nd is the fall equinox. And in terms of solar years, it'll be 699 years exactly since Dante died. Dante died on the fall equinox of 1321.
Yes.
The Julian calendar marks that as September 14th. But we know that it is September 22nd because it was the fall equinox, right? And we know about the errors of the Julian calendar. So 699 solar years since Dante died. And I think this year it's a Tuesday. But I wondered if maybe you would be amenable to doing the first one of our Dante talks. It doesn't have to be with a guest. It could be just you and I. Maybe starting with the commedia from the beginning or thematically. Maybe instead of doing it from the beginning, maybe you can do it thematically, right? Maybe you can choose a particular theme to talk about. That way we get to move through the text freely. And so and we could set up for a time that's not as late for you. Maybe earlier in the day, and also because it'll be a Tuesday. I know I teach from 11 to 2:30, so maybe you can do it early in the day for me, which would be maybe you can do it at 8 o'clock my time, right? Which would be, what time would that be for you?
That would be 6 hours later.
So 2 o'clock your time, like 2 in the afternoon?
Around 3 o'clock, isn't it?
Okay. So is it 3 o'clock? Okay. So so would you have the afternoon free for that? Maybe we can
do that. We might get some interruptions because I work from 3 until 6 with people coming into the cemetery. But
Okay, so how about then? I could go even earlier, actually. Maybe we could go
that would
from.
be 7 o'clock in the morning
My
for
dear,
you.
I wake up at 5. I wake up at 5 in the
Bless you. I
morning.
wake up at 4.
Yeah, I wake up at 5, and I usually wait for the sun to come up before I go running. But if on Tuesday we choose to, even if we start at 6 o'clock, that might be more comfortable, actually. You say it's 6 hours later, so that would be from noon.
Right.
Maybe from noon to 2, just
Yeah,
set that time
that
off.
would be excellent. That would be.
Okay, so that would be for me for 6 to 8, and
Mhm.
then after we finish, I could go from my run from 8 to 10, and I'd be back for my class at 11 o'clock. Yeah.
Yes.
So why don't we make a date and make our first just
Right.
conversation about Dante?
Mhm. Okay. This is my agenda.
Okay, beautiful. Let me see what's on the
Have
cover.
you? Yeah. Società Dantesca Italiana. Are you a part of it?
I'm a part of it. Yes.
Yes. Right. You get the calendar.
I haven't looked. Oh no, they haven't mailed me anything. Is that their calendar?
Yes.
Oh no, they haven't sent it to me.
It's beautiful.
Okay.
Mhm. Okay. And now, what date are you thinking of?
September 22nd.
Okay. It's going to be very. We're doing everything in September. Yes, that day is free. Okay.
Oh, brilliant.
So noon here.
So, yeah, from your time, noon to 2 o'clock.
Mhm.
And over here for me, it'll be from 6 to 8 a.m.
Okay.
And would you like me to post these also, not necessarily on Zamani, but I have this other Facebook page called Dante Decrypted.
Oh, that sounds lovely.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I could put it on there, and then other people might get a chance to listen in on the conversation. And then if we want to make it a regular Tuesday thing, we could do that.
Mhm.
For as long as we want to, and just yeah, make it a thematic conversation. We have some time between now and then to maybe settle on a theme or several themes for our
Right.
first talk.
Mhm.
So let's think through it, and then we'll figure out what to talk about. And what's really great is if we decide on a theme, for me at least, I'll be able to revisit the text and refresh my memory of
Right.
something.
Right. Um,
Um,
perhaps with your expertise, if we
mhm.
began with music,
Ooh, that would be fantastic.
that way we leap over the inferno. Um,
Oh, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes,
and
oh yes.
have you looked at Musica della Commedia? Have you?
Musica della Commedia, which is, are you talking about an
Okay,
article
it's on
or?
YouTube.
Uh-huh.
It I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay.
I worked with a group of Italian musicologists and
Mhm.
early music performers.
I remember you talked about this in
That's right.
Philadelphia. Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. Okay, I remember. I remember.
And they went to the manuscripts that
Mm-hmm,
Dante would have, that
mm-hmm,
were swirling about Dante.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And we performed it. It was a
mm-hmm,
2 hours concert.
mm-hmm,
And it was absolutely, and we did it for the YouTube
mm-hmm,
with the images from the manuscripts, from
mm-hmm,
the mosaics, from
mm-hmm,
sculpture,
mm-hmm,
and we did it. And I did the Dante Vivo
mm-hmm,
project. This was part of it, so that I could put the music into the cantos where it
mm-hmm,
belonged.
mm-hmm,
To because I was finding the Italians hated Dante,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and because he's taught so badly.
Yes, yes.
And Dante is sensual.
Mm-hmm,
He sees, he
mm-hmm,
smells,
mm-hmm,
touches.
mm-hmm,
He's using all five
mm-hmm,
senses in the
mm-hmm.
text,
Yes.
and our modern education doesn't allow that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's too
Yes,
abstract and intellectual.
yes, yes.
So we were trying to go back
Mm-hmm,
into his mode
mm-hmm,
of being read,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
believing that that would help the young students
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
of Haiti.
mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm.
he's Italy's soul. And,
Yeah, yeah. This
so,
I noticed this the way I registered the way Italians, and I mean this is sort of grosso modo, right? Sort of in a sort of a generalized way. The way I registered their reaction whenever I said I love Dante is
yes,
they seem traumatized, right?
it's so
And I
difficult. It's too
yeah,
difficult.
and I realized that their trauma was exactly due to what you just said because of the
Yes,
way they're force fed
right.
Dante in an incredibly unpalatable way. And I
In
think
a
to
very
myself,
superficial. Mhm.
how is it that you miss the incredible beauty of
Yes,
this
mhm,
sublime text,
yes,
when you
yes,
grow up with it? And I realize it's because they're tortured with it, right?
yes,
So of course they build an aversion to it,
yes.
which is
No, the
so tragic. Yeah.
contadini recite him by
Mhm,
heart, and they love.
mhm, mhm.
But it's the educated people who have
Yeah.
had Dante taught in the way that.
In such a traumatizing way. Talk about trauma. Seriously.
Yes, yes. Well, actually, even the teaching of Virgil was rather traumatic for
Yes,
Augustine.
yes, yes. Yeah.
And when he talks about the leather curtain over the
Mm-hmm,
schoolroom door, so
mm-hmm.
because you know the Benozzo Gozzoli frescoes in are they in Arezzo? No, uh, which show the schoolboy Augustine being beaten by the schoolgirl.
No, I don't know it.
It really shows what goes wrong in education.
Okay, all
You
right.
can have,
I'll look it up. I'll look it
yeah,
up. Oh,
mhm.
that sounds
And
horrific.
they're wonderful frescoes, but that
Yeah,
scene is absolutely devastating.
yeah. I'll look it up. Oh my gosh.
Which you go
Um,
back to with when I was a child. No, actually, Augustine goes back to the child as being the innocent, but then he also talks about the child who is jealous of the other child, and he comes
mhm,
up with the doctrine of original sin,
mhm, mhm,
which
mhm,
he just about invents,
mhm.
and so forth. Well, I am so grateful for this opportunity
And
to.
I am too. I'm so grateful for your company and delighted by these conversations. So we have a date on
Right.
September 22nd. We
Yeah.
The rain roundtables will continue through
Yeah.
October 3rd, and
Mhm.
then we'll have the final sort of big roundtable that
Right.
is everything on October 10th, which
Yeah.
is I think that's the Monday before Columbus Day. But the Dante roundtables, which start on September 22nd with you and I love that we're starting with music. I'm going to let a couple of musicologist friends that I know who love Dante about it. I'm going to tell them about it and invite them to join us if they would like.
That would be wonderful.
Um, and
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be the only time we talk about music. We can always come back to music again another
Yes.
time.
And
Um,
then we can also try to get. I'd love to get Malcolm Guaiti.
okay.
He's a splendid theologian, poet,
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
motorcycle rider, jazz player who looks
Oh,
like a
fantastic.
hobbit.
Yeah. Yes,
And
yes.
he was chaplain at Girton in
Mhm,
Cambridge.
mhm, mhm.
And he's wonderful. He's an Anglican priest. And he's written gorgeous things. He's written a book on Coleridge's Ancient Mariner.
Ah, uh-huh.
And he's written wonderful poems on Dante, on the Commedia, on reading the
Mhm,
Commedia.
mhm, mhm,
And I, we've actually lectured together. And I
mhm.
think if we get Dennis Looney, I think if we get
Yes,
Gumguaiti and so forth,
yes, yes,
get
yes, yes.
variety.
I think it would be wonderful, and I love the sort of the relaxed and freeform nature of this. I know that I don't want this to become a sort of lectura dante sort of thing, just a
Yes,
conversation, just a conversation.
right.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yes. Mhm.
so my dear, thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you,
Sleep
and bless
well.
you, and good
Yes,
night.
you too, my dear. Buonanotte, sogni d'oro, and
Dormi bene, sogni d'oro.
grazie. E ci vediamo il sabato prossimo, ok?
Bene. Okay.
Okay, see you, my dear. Bye.
Bye.
And this is the end. Oop, how do I close this? Oh, there we go. And broadcast. Yes.